All right, good afternoon. It is my pleasure to introduce James Trulock of Indianapolis, Indiana. I got in the blurb about Jim. This is a fascinating story. I had no idea. Jim and I go way back. I grew up in Indianapolis. Jim was a mentor of mine. It was a wonderful time to be studying the Civil War in the 1980s because we had this amazing Civil War roundtable that had Jim Trulock, Alice Trulock, who many of you know because of In the Hands of Providence, the biography of Joshua Chamberlain. And we also had Alan Nolan. Alan Nolan, who's been a long friend of CWI, a man that we both miss a great deal. He was a wonderful man, a great intellect. The point being is that it was an intellectual environment in a Civil War roundtable that's rarely found. It was a fantastic place. But Jim's interest in the Civil War did not begin by going to a roundtable. Rather, it was in 1949. His mother insisted that she accompany him, that he accompany her to the English Hotel. In the English Hotel, it was the last encampment of the Grand Army of the Republic. And Jim saw 4 of the 8 veterans in attendance. And since that moment, he has had a lifelong obsession with the Civil War. As I mentioned, he was in the Indianapolis Civil War Roundtable. He's lectured at a number of various historical associations. But his great contribution that I'll say, hope that you don't disagree with this, it is sort of unsung, is his work in the Hands of Providence. He very graciously allowed Alice, his wife at the time, who passed away, to be identified as the author of the book. And she certainly made a major contribution and wrote most of the book, but Jim was right there with her. They did the research together. He wrote some of the book as well. And so a lot of people don't really appreciate that In the Hands of Providence was a collaborative effort. And that book, as you know, was well regarded when it was published by the University of North Carolina Press. It was the first book on Chamberlain since In the Soul of the Lion. It is a standard on Chamberlain. It's magnificently written. And then, of course, the research is impeccable. So it is always nice, as I said before, when you come to CWI and you get a chance to see old friends. It's especially rewarding for me to have an opportunity to be able to introduce, again, not just a dear friend, but a man who was a mentor to me from a very early age. I was just a kid. I used to go over to their house, and they would sit back in their living room, and they would allow me to give my talks, practice runs. I used to speak about an artillerist named Willie Pegram. I was 15, 16 years old, and you guys spent an inordinate amount of time with me. Deeply appreciative of it, and we're going to put in for a real treat today. Jim Trulock on Joshua Chamberlain.
Hello, everyone. Pete came to us at the Indianapolis Civil War Roundtable when he was 12, and was an astounding authority on Willie Pegram even then. And his general knowledge of the Civil War just was wonderful to behold in someone so young. Well, Dr. Carmichael has come a long way, and we're all very proud of you back home. I've studied J.L. Chamberlain now for over 35 years, off and on at least, and I've come to believe that I know him pretty well. I know him as you do through what was said about him and his deeds, about the esteem heaped upon him by others. I know him from his prolific and quite well-preserved correspondence by letters written to him, what others have said about him privately, and what historians have interpreted from all of that. I even know him from his testimony at the G.K. Warren Court of Inquiry, which, by the way, as far as I know, is the only verbatim record of his conversational English. It is, of course, stunted and precise. He's in the witness stand. but it does give us some idea of his verbal phraseology. But I think I know him best by what he said and wrote publicly about the meaning of his struggles and those of the nation in the Civil War. The war defined him and his country. It was, as Lincoln had said about the country, a new birth of freedom, and it certainly was for Chamberlain as well. In a very real sense, he spent the rest of his life explaining what had happened and why it was important to those who lived through it, and important to us too. That's what I want to talk to you about today. The words, the public words of the man. I might say at this point, just to set the context, that Chamberlain was very much a 19th century man and wrote in that wonderfully colorful, sometimes lengthy Victorian style. I believe it's a beautiful and romantic language, and I often find myself quite taken by its flowing and flowery meter. There is a lyrical quality to Chamberlain's writing. You can almost conduct it as you would music. One of the reasons Chamberlain was so good at it was his little secret. He stuttered. On certain consonant syllables, and there's a medical term for it which escapes me right now, but it's the consonant syllables cause your mouth to close. M, P, B, those syllables. To speak the eloquence required a kind of cadent structure that brings his expressed thought to life. I'm sure many of you remember the country singer Mel Tillis, and how he stuttered so terribly, except when he sang. Chamberlain, in his own inner thoughts and in his own mind, sang his public expression. He kept meter, and that's one of the things that makes it so good. He wrote an autobiographical work about his early life. I'm not sure exactly when it was written, certainly not before 1880. We now have it in total. When I first found it, Bowdoin had part of it, and part of it was in a private collection in New Jersey. It's a little capsuled vision of a time long ago, even when he wrote it. And whether it was meant to be read aloud or not, and I think it was, it certainly needs to be. It's about fields of hay in mowing time. Here it is, and listen to the lyrical quality of it. Ring go the scythes through the tall grasses, softened by the night dews. High tossed on nimble forks, fly the tall flakes, scattered and spread to dry in the noontide sun. Raked toward nightfall are the windrows to smolder in their fragrance under the brooding darkness, twined and spread on the morrow, yielding back to the air the moisture they drank from the earth, and working in their very core the mystic chemistry of sunshine from another world, rolled in great heaps and piled up in cones at evening, standing in rank and order under the misty moonlight like a mighty host encamped. And then the fragrance of the night, the woods, the distilling grasses, the waters, the very earth of the meadow bottom, is that perfume of the soul or of the body. This memoir of youth, written decades later, says a lot about him. First of all, it seems obvious that what I've just read is a deeply felt, idealized vision of a time and place. And we all know how that is. It seems perfect years later, although it may very well not have been at the time. Nor do the mystic chords of memory always represent the true event except as our subsequent experience and knowledge layer upon it. Chamberlain speaks of this scene of hayfields with that perspective. And is it now memory of the mind, or is it imperishable part and parcel of the things themselves? Chamberlain asks some pretty deep questions in his public writing. It is his way, the Socratic way, the way of a teacher. And he didn't always provide the answers to them. I think in part because he's not always sure. It is to me an endearing human quality, and one which binds me to him. In this memoir, he writes of the many influences and people of his young life, and one whom I think was his model not only for his teaching career, but as an example for his skill in communicating the meaning of a thing in its larger context too. His name was Daniel R. Goodwin. He taught French and Latin at Bowdoin. Here's what he said about it. He did more than to hear the lessons or even teach. He broadened, he inspired, he integrated knowledge and animated it, vitalized it. Studying French in this way, the boy, referring to himself in the third person, could see into Latin and know something about language. More than that, he began to learn to think into things as well as to think it out. And just as a little aside, think of how that applies to Little Round Top. Goodwin and others, certainly his parents, taught him to, as he said, rise to the heights of life, which means in truth to withdraw within the consciousness of nature's true mobility, the supremacy of the spiritual over the material. Then one can set his compass and fix his resolve. I will be worthy of what is best in me. Hold myself ready for what is noblest in doing or suffering as the days of God unfold. That last sentence comes as close to a statement of his creed as any he ever wrote, and guided the actions of his life. I will be worthy of what is best in me, hold myself ready for what is noblest and doing and suffering as the days of God unfold. It is the spiritual framework of all he was to become, and I will add here that Chamberlain puts the phrase in quotations, and Ralph Waldo Emerson uses those exact words to describe the passage of time as the days of God unfold. There is, to my knowledge, no direct evidence that Lawrence, and by the way, for those of you who don't know, his family and his friends all called him Lawrence. He was Lawrence Chamberlain. And that's for a number of reasons. One is his father was also named Joshua, and it served to separate, or just make the distinction between the two. There's nothing that I know of that where Lawrence relates his progress to the teachings and philosophies of Emerson. Yet his recollection of college days attests to the influence of Emerson and the other transcendentalists, and as do the speeches after the war, particularly those made right here at Gettysburg in 1889. No intellectual of the time, of course, could have stood completely aloof from Emerson and the other greats of transcendentalism. This certainly included Chamberlain, and as he grew in understanding and maturity, it reflected in his speeches and in his writing. Gary Will's excellent study, Lincoln at Gettysburg, postulates that the Gettysburg Address is a transcendental statement. He is right about that. But there were two others delivered 26 years later at Gettysburg that transcend as well. And they were given by Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. Shortly after the war, to be precise, on Washington's birthday, 1866, so we're talking like 9-10 months after the war. Chamberlain spoke to the most prestigious and star-studded audience of his life. In Philadelphia, he delivered what amounted to the keynote address for the Military Order of Loyal Legion of the United States, MOLS. It was a signal honor to have been selected to do this, and the stellar group that was assembled to hear it could only be, I think, rivaled by a presidential inauguration or State of the Union message. I think President Andrew Johnson was there, but I'm not absolutely certain, so I can't tell you that for sure. There were several Supreme Court justices there. There were at least 2 governors, and I think 4, but at least 2. Many senators, many congressmen, 2 university presidents, a score or more of celebrated generals from the late war. On such a unique occasion and to such an august audience, you better be good. I contend to you that from an evident list of potential great speakers, they picked the right guy to do the job. He delivered just what they wanted to hear. A lengthy tome on the reasons for the Civil War, and an exaltation of those who had given so much, living and dead, and a call to be vigilant to protect what was so sacrificially won. The speech is called Loyalty, and I believe today we could subtitle that speech. We could call it What the War Was About and Why I Fought It. I'll read you just a few excerpts from it to give you an idea of its concepts, and once again, that lyrical flow of his language. He is, as I see it, beginning to feel the broader meaning of the conflict, as well as developing phrasing that would show up 23 years later in what I consider to be his best speeches, the ones given here. He starts the loyalty speech with thanks and salutations, and then begins to talk about the awakening of the country to the mortal danger it was going through. There strikes an hour when slumbering forces burst into bloom, shoot into crystal, blaze into deed. So it was for our country, so it was for us. Knowing not what should be for us to do or suffer in the filling of our days, we were holding ourselves true to such ideals as we saw, striving to be building that steadfastness of soul which meets with level eyes whatever assails our honor and our peace, ready for what duty should summon or fate unroll. We were studying patriotism and loyalty as best we could, unconscious that we were preparing to take part in completing their definitions. We have learned what manhood is, what cost is, in everything held of worth. We know now what we are and what we belong to, and what character is under this name of country. So we meet today having passed the storm and struggle, the trial and vindication, not self-glorying, but self-contained, more in our thoughts, more in our hearts than before. And then looking with hopeful awe at the sacrifice that they'd all just been through, and seeing as if through a glass darkly some of the meaning emerging into the future, he said, looking back a little all around us, and we ourselves seem lifted out of due place and portion, made part of some phantasmagoria of infernal forces mocking our common life, the sky is still aglow as with dying conflagration. But before us looms the dawn, diffusing the phantoms, broadening into the broad truth of day, under which things will take on their rightful form and relation. What this was for will be made manifest. What we shall be will appear. These are the days of great things. After the slow travail of the centuries, we celebrate the deliverance of the nation. Chamberlain then begins a lengthy analysis of the causes for which they had fought and relates it strongly to the title of his talk, Loyalty, dissecting the name of the organization they were founding, and which of course does still thrive. I will try to condense it some, a risky task, and one which to one degree or another comes from the sensibilities of the one doing the condensing, me. Here's the way he said it. We are summoned here in the warrant of strong words. The very phrase of your official title shows in every word not only a potent thought, but a veritable fact of history. The Military Order of Loyal Legion of the United States. Monumental, presageful words. The words gathered to their climax, the United States, the reason, the justification, and the end of all. The potent name which tests loyalty and summoned it to make good its meaning. Loyalty, then, is not mere conformity. It is fidelity, truth to faith, constancy of soul. Its true action is not constrained obedience to a superior, but the keeping of a covenant, freely forthgiving to an answering ideal of right and good to which one is spiritually bound. Was our loyalty to a dream or prophecy or to a living truth, which is living fact, concrete enough whether we see it or not? We had not time for reflection. We went into that cause not asking ourselves for its meaning, but its meaning was there. We seek to know it now. Neither law nor life is the end. The realization of human worth, that is the end. And the justification of life and law. No other law than this was our loyalty bounded and bound. Well, there you have it. J.L. Chamberlain's view of the Great Civil War, what the Great Civil War was about. Such a great encompassing event, such tumultuous and momentous times, such horrific suffering, can never be summed up in a phrase or capsulized in any way that does justice to the revolutionary changes in millions of lives. But he knew what the essence was for him, and that was no more clearly expressed in any of his writings than on that Washington's birthday long ago. It, even at that early stage of his examination of events and searching of his own soul, transcends the cause of government structures, territories, or rightful secession of power, or definitions of political subdivisions. It was, as he said, the realization of human worth. And he stated that to an assembly so distinguished and so powerful. They were indeed the leadership of America. Chamberlain also took the opportunity to talk some about slavery. In my studies, it is his most in-depth and lengthy analysis, and he saw it not so much as a reason for going to war, but once war was imposed by his lights, by the Confederacy on the United States of America, he saw its end as inexorably tied to the successful conclusion of the conflict. It was, as he saw it, a card played by the southern states, trumped by the United States. Here's the way he put it. There can be no doubt that the sentiment and intent of the whole country was that a system so repugnant to justice and freedom as that of slavery should be limited, not extended, repressed, not encouraged, and that some way should be found to satisfy equitable rights of property and wipe that blot from off our escutcheon. What a century of concession could not do, secession did. It proclaimed a confederacy built on the cornerstone of slavery, and the cornerstone itself was overturned. Finally, he said this about the former slaves: a great, difficult duty is laid upon us all to help the poor, surprised race among us whose enfranchisement was the signal incident of the war, to make themselves truly free. There was so much more to the speech. It took him over an hour to deliver it. It was, I believe, the most succinctly patriotic speech he ever made. And for me, really one of the great addresses of our history. It has been lost to obscurity until now. And it still, of course, doesn't get the recognition that I feel it deserves. There's abiding strength in it, and a love and devotion to the nation and the people that Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain could so lyrically express so many years ago in the birthplace of our nation. Now I want to concentrate on the more widely known and often quoted talks that he gave in the autumn afternoon and evening of October 3rd, 1889, right here. They were addressed to the members of his old regiment and their families and their friends at the dedication of the 20th Maine Monument, later to all of the people of Maine who had gathered here, come down to dedicate the resting place of their boys who had died 26 years before. At the 20th Maine Monument dedication, he did talk briefly about the controversies that even then were beginning to come forth about the details of the battle. And I believe put it in an appropriate context. He said, "I take note of the surprise of several officers here that it was some other than any one of them who came to me in the course of the fight with information to the enemy of the enemy's extended movements to envelop our left. Now, as might well be believed of such gentlemen and soldiers, they are all right. Not one of them's wrong." Then speaking about the charge down Little Round Top, he said, "I'm sorry to have heard it intimated that any hesitated when that order was given. That was not so. No man hesitated. There might be an appearance of it to those who did not understand the whole situation. The left wing bent back like an oxbow, or sharp lunette." I looked up that word. It comes from the word luna. Lunette. Crescent. Luna. Lunette. The left wing bent back like a sharp lunette had taken some little time to come up into line to our general front so as to form the close continuous edge which was to strike like a sword cut upon the enemy's ranks. By the time they'd gotten up and straightened the line, the center salient, you may be sure, was already in motion. Nobody hesitated to obey the order. In fact, to tell the truth, the order was never given or imperfectly. You hear that? The order was never given or imperfectly. The enemy was already pressing up the slope. There was no need or time for the words, "bayonet forward to the right." The quick-witted and tense men caught the words out of my lips and almost the action out of my hands. So much an elucidation of fact. You see, there may be stories apparently not consistent with each other, yet all of them are true in their time and place, and so far as each actor is concerned. And while everyone here, officer and soldier, did more than his duty and acted with utmost intelligence and spirit, you must permit me to add the remark that I commanded my regiment that day. So in spite of the controversy, he felt like he had to make that point too. And let me interject here too, just a little bit of wisdom from the 20th century writer Ernest Hemingway, from his last novel, Islands in the Stream. The protagonist of the story, which certainly is Ernest Hemingway himself, on his deathbed says, "All my life I have sought the truth." How ironic that here, as I lay dying, it becomes so clear. It is all true. All human experience is true. What needs to be understood, I believe, is that when we study an event, we are, for the most part, studying accounts of that event. And while they are very real to the accountant, they are subjective in their very nature. What I see and experience filters through all my own sensibilities when I relate it to you. And then it must go through your own. I'm simply saying that when we hear or read accounts of the past, we are hearing part of the truth, the whole of which never can be known. I've also learned this. No one comes out poorly in his autobiography. Or comes out not central to it. This is true of everyone, including J.L. Chamberlain. No speeches he ever made, I think, are more revealing of the man, and no others tell us more about what he believed than these speeches at Gettysburg did. He wanted his comrades to know what he thought they all did and what it personally meant to him. Not so much about who stood where or who said what and in what sequence, but about the transcendence of the deeds, of those defining hours, of who they were in that moment of time, frozen for all of them, and frozen for us too. On the hill, to his own men, he gave meaning to what they had done together. The lessons impressed upon me, he said, as I stand here and my heart and mind traverse your faces in the years that are gone, is that in great momentous struggles like those commemorated here, it is character that tells. I do not mean simply or chiefly bravery. Many a man has that who may become surprised or disconcerted at a sudden change in the posture of affairs. What I mean by character is a firm and seasoned substance of soul. I mean such qualities or acquirements as intelligence, thoughtfulness, conscientiousness, right-mindedness, fortitude, unconquerable resolve. I could see all this on your faces when you were coming into position for the desperate encounter, man by man, file by file, on the right, into line. I knew that you knew what was at stake, what was staked on your endurance and heroism. Some of you heard Vincent say to me, with such earnestness and prophetic eyes, pointing to the right of our position and the front of the oncoming attack. You understand, Colonel. This ground must be held at all costs. I did understand with a heavy weight on my mind and spirit, and you understood, and it was done. I do not know whether any friend who stands here on this calm and sunny day comprehend how the weight of such a responsibility presses upon the spirit. We were young then. We do not count ourselves old yet, and these things were done 26 years ago. We believe we could do them now, but we wonder how we could do them then. Doubtless the spring and elasticity of youth helped to bear the burden and recover from the shock, but something more than youthful ardor and dash was demanded for such a test, and that was yours. In thought and habit, in experience, you were veterans. It was a matter, as I have said, of character. It was the soul of youth suddenly springing to the flush of manhood. And so it is. We know not of the future and cannot plan for it much, but we can hold our spirits and bodies so pure and high, cherish such thoughts and such ideals, and dream such dreams of lofty purpose that we can determine what manner of men we will be whenever and wherever the hour strikes that calls to noble action. This predestination God has given us in charge. No man becomes suddenly different from his habit and his cherished thought. We carry custom manners with us, and it was the boyhood you brought from your homes that made you men, which braced your hearts, which shone upon your foreheads, which held you steadfast in mind and body, and lifted these heights of Gettysburg to immortal glory. I thought of titling this talk, Such Dreams of Lofty Purpose, because it epitomizes Chamberlain's thoughts and feelings about preparedness for the adaptability to unpredicted circumstance as they accomplished and that faced him in his whole Civil War career. It's been said that strategy ends when the enemy comes into sight, and then it becomes a tactical matter. But Chamberlain rightfully asserts in his dedication speech that the real strategy is to prepare oneself, as well as the organization, for whatever might be presented, however difficult. It's just that is just what they did, and he paid tribute to their magnificent accomplishment that day. No man is different from his habit and his cherished thought. It was true of the men of the 20th Maine, and he had known it about himself for a long time. Self-doubting as he could be about some things, and about some of the most profound experiences of his life, he was sure of that, and it gave him the strategy for his life. Habit and cherished thought brought him to the understanding of a transcendent self that he would express later that evening to those gathered to remember and honor Maine's men at Gettysburg. He began that evening to speak in a particularly 19th century way, a short sentence followed by a lengthy one. I recite them now as an example of the patriotic way of oratory in the American Victorian style, also as an opportunity I seldom get, which is to read an 80-word sentence out loud. Here goes. Short sentence. The state of Maine stands here today for the first time in her own name. Short sentence. In other days she was here indeed, here in power, here in majesty, here in glory, but as elsewhere and often in the centuries before, with that humility that is perhaps the necessary law of exaltation, her worth merged in a name mightier than her own, so here, content to be part of that greater being that she held dearer than self, but which was made more worthy of honor by her belonging to it, the United States of America. Isn't that majestic? We don't talk like that anymore. He went on once again to carefully delineate the causes of the war and to discuss the meaning of the struggle, including his abhorrence of the term war between the states. He hated that term. He didn't like that term at all. He said that underneath the phrase lies the false assumption that our union is but a compact of states. He was very adamant about it. This was no war between the states, he said. It was a war in the name of certain states to destroy the political existence of the United States. He talked about this before and often later, but he began to transform this speech as he went along into what I think is his most revealing public personal statement about life. It builds to the sublime and I think represents his understanding of the soul's transcendent being and purpose. Here are his words. It is something great and greatening to cherish an ideal, to act in the light of truth that is far away and far above, to set aside the near advantage, the momentary pleasure, the snatching of seeming good to self, and to act for remoter ends, for higher good, and for interests other than our own. To us, this people and its life on earth was a moral personality, having a character and commission hence responsibility, hence duty, hence right, and its authority. The union was a body of a spiritual unity. Of this we were part responsible to it and for it, and our sacrifice was to its service. There is a mysterious law of nature that in the sense of membership and participation, the Spirit rises to a magnitude commensurate with that of which it is a part. The greatness of the whole passes into the consciousness of each. The power of the whole seems to become the power of each. And the character of the whole is impressed upon each. The inspiration of a noble cause involving human interests far and wide enables men to do things they did not dream themselves capable of before, and which they were not capable of alone. The consciousness of belonging vitally to something beyond individuality, of being part of a personality that reaches we know not where in space and time, greatens the heart to the limit of the soul's ideal and builds out the supreme of character. It was something like this, I think, which marked our motive. And then at the end he pays homage to the dead in a manner the like of which I believe is rarely equaled in the annals of war. Now you have gathered these bodies here. You mark their names with headstones and compass them about with the cordon of the state's proud sorrow. You station them here on the ground they held. Here they will remain, not buried, but transfigured forms. Part of the earth they glorified, part of the glory that is to be. No chemistry of frost or rain, no overlaying mold of the season's recurrent life and death can ever separate from the soil of these consecrated fields the life, blood, so deeply commingled and incorporate here. Ever henceforth under the rolling suns, when these hills are touched to splendor with the morning light, or smile a farewell to the lingering day, the flush that broods upon them shall be rich with a strange crimson tone, not of the earth, nor yet of the sky, but mediator and hostage between the two. But these monuments are not to commemorate the dead alone. Death was but the divine acceptance of life freely offered by everyone. Service was the central fact. They marked the centers around which stood the manhood of Maine, steadfast in noble service to the uttermost, to the uppermost. Those who fell here, those who have fallen before or since, those who linger yet a little longer, are all mustered in that one great company on the shining heights of life, with that star of Maine's armorial ensign upon their foreheads forever, like the ranks of a galaxy. In great deeds, something abide. On great fields, something stays. Forms change and pass. Bodies disappear. But spirits linger to consecrate ground for the vision place of souls. And reverent men and women from afar in generations that know us not and that we know not of, heart drawn to see where and by whom great things were done for them, shall come to this deathless field to ponder and to dream, and lo, a shadow of a mighty presence shall wrap them in its bosom, and the power of the vision pass into their souls. This is the great reward for service, to live far out and on in the lives of others. This is the mystery of the Christ, to give life's best for such high stakes that it shall be found again unto life eternal. The contemporary critic Harold Bloom was asked a few years ago why, although he was such a great admirer of Henry James, he had never attempted to write his biography. His answer was most revealing to me. He said it was because Henry James revised his own work so well, there was not much he could add. When I heard that, it was an epiphany for me. What Chamberlain wrote and said so eloquently speaks for itself and does not need my revision or anybody else's. When we write biography, that is in part what we are doing, revising through our own prism, our own outlook, however dedicated to factual accuracy we may be. Our own relationship to the subject comes in and we interpret life through it. It is no secret, I am sure, that my study and Alice Trulock's study emanated from our admiration of J.L. Chamberlain. It abides in me, pretty obviously, today, no less than it did in the beginning, about his accomplishments of life. And at the time of the publication of In the Hands of Providence, a new work on his life, supported by intensive and extensive new research, was needed. The deeds of his life needed to be told, and the words too. We interspersed throughout the book quotations from his own writing and italicized them so that they would stand apart from the narrative. We did so because his words stand alone as some of the most eloquent writing of his time. They lend a lyrical meaning to the tragedy and the spiritual depth of our renewed nation. They do not need revision, and they are the great legacy of Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. In great deeds, something abides, and in great prose, we understand more profoundly their meaning to us as Americans and as human beings. In closing, let me tell you about something that happened to Chamberlain in the last days of the war on April 1st, 1865, 8 days before Appomattox, at the Battle of Five Forks. A young man he had grown to care for very much, quite literally died in his arms. He actually died 2 days later, but he lost consciousness there. He never regained it. He'd ordered him previously to take a little pocket of resistance that was momentarily stalling the advance of the Union troops, and in doing so, the lad was shot. His name was Edwin Glenn. He was from Frankfort, Pennsylvania. Joshua Chamberlain leaned down to him, weeping, and told him what he could. He said, "I will remember you." And so he did. 36 years later, in Glenn's hometown newspaper, he told the story of Glenn's death. Still remembering him, still touching him with his love. That tale of Chamberlain, so hauntingly told in the twilight years of his own life, reminds me of what you all do now in your commitment to preserve the heritage of the Civil War days. In doing so, you're telling the boys of long ago what Chamberlain told Edwin Glenn. You're saying, "I will remember. I will remember you." We'll never know all their names. We'll never know very many of their stories. But we can remember, as you are doing. Thank you for doing that. Thanks for listening to me. If you have some questions, I'll attempt some answers.
As I have done some research on Chamberlain in Maine, my wife and I stayed one night some years ago at the Harriet Beecher Stowe home, which you can't do much of that anymore there. But nevertheless, there were Professor and Mrs. Stowe together
Right.
Inviting the Bowdoin young students into their home to be by the fireside while she would read a chapter at a time of her new book.
Yes.
We never invited her here, but Uncle Tom's Cabin was written. They listened to those chapters one by one. Can you tell us a little bit about Professor and Mrs. Stowe's values and how they were imparted to Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain?
I could do that, I think. Calvin Stowe and Harriet Beecher Stowe were ardent abolitionists. And by the way, let me just say that Harriet Beecher Stowe disliked intensely her time in Brunswick. She didn't like Brunswick, it's too cold. She wanted to come south somewhere. And they later did indeed move south. Calvin Stowe was Chamberlain's professor of rhetoric. He and his fiancée, Frances Caroline Adams, would be invited to Professor Stowe's house to hear Mrs. Stowe's latest chapter of this book she was writing before she would send it off to the New Era for serialized publication. I've learned some new things about that, and I'll share a couple of them with. One thing is not so new. Calvin Stowe was, well, he's been dead a long time. I'm going to go ahead and say it. He was a Mad Hatter. He had a puka, an imaginary animal, which he took to class with him, in which the students were required to acknowledge. He was a brilliant man. I say that in the context of his brilliance. He was a brilliant man. Guess what the puka's name was? Harvey. I still haven't researched enough to find out if that's where the play Harvey comes from. It very well may have been. His puka was named Harvey too. So, at any rate, here's another thing that I only recently learned. Some new letters have come to light, largely from Frances Caroline Adams, Fanny Adams. Some of them are to her originating family back in Boston. She was raised by her uncle, which was indeed like her father, who was the minister at the First Parish Church of Brunswick. At any rate, one of these is from 1839. The kid's 13 years old. And it's a little girl's letter. We're still working on that quilt I told you about. We're going to bake a chocolate cake tonight. Yesterday, I joined the Juvenile Anti-Slavery League. This is in 1839. She's 13 years old. Who wanted to go down to hear Uncle Tom's Cabin? I suggest it might have been Fanny Adams. Fanny Adams, who became Fanny Chamberlain. Yes, sir.
Yes, since you spoke about Chamberlain essentially as a man of letters, and also taking your mention of Henry James and Harold Bloom as a thought, I wonder if you could address the question of what contemporary writers of the post-Civil War era Chamberlain read and how he related in general to the world of American letters at the time.
That's a very good question. People usually say that when they don't know the answer, and that's true. It's true for me. I know a little of the answer. Here goes. Two of them were Bowdoin graduates, Nathaniel Hawthorne and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. In his account of his experiences at the Battle of Gettysburg, for example, he quotes a bit of Longfellow's poem, The Clock on the Wall. as a child in a very strict Congregationalist home. He was not allowed to read novels. He read his first one as a student at Bowdoin. It was The House of Seven Gables. Beyond that, I'm trying to think of any particular reference to the literary folk of the day, and that's it for the moment. They're kind of standard and popular writers of the day. And another I have to say is Edward Hale, a little later. He and Edward Hale started a magazine together that did not survive, called, I think it was called at the time New England Magazine. And it was a literary magazine. Trying to think of writers that contributed to it, and I think perhaps Henry James contributed a couple of pieces to it. That's a vague answer, isn't it? I'm sorry. I don't know. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
My name is Ken McCallister from San Antonio, Texas. It's a
Very
real
good.
privilege to be here with Jim and John Foley, the ladies on.
We've worked together before.
Yes, we have, and I learned a great deal from these men and a woman named L.P. Butler. Tell me more about Chamberlain, and I've been writing about James's medical problems and have presented them here on a couple of occasions, and I learned so much.
They are the definitive work on that subject.
I was presiding as associate dean over the graduation of some 300 military medical graduates, and every year after we had the prayer of invocation, I read in great deeds something about it. And every man almost asked me for a copy of those words as they left. But I think one of the things about Chamberlain, we often wonder, where was his humor? Where was his humor? And you may know the stories in my paper, but you may know it already. And on the march to Chancellorsville, it was time, the regimental surgeon says it's time to immunize against smallpox. And in that era, you could either have the cowpox vaccine, which Albert Jenner had used in England, or you might have an attenuated smallpox vaccine that was passed among the men in your regiment. It sounds really archaic. Like you could pass it through a petri dish.
Speak to the mic, please.
You could pass it through a petri dish. And so they pulled over. The regimental surgeon probably got out his flame and lighted it up and made up an archaic vaccine and gave it to the regiment. And the regiment, some 15 or 20 men were ill, and 2 or 3, as I remember, died. The command post from Hooker's command came forward and said, "You can't go into battle," which might have been a break. Chancellor's
As it turns out.
You can't go into battle. And Chambers said, "We must go into battle." He said, "No, you can't." He said, "But you could infect the entire Union Army." And Chambers said, "Can't we at least infect the rebels?" So, and going through his medical issues, that's one of the areas of humor. But I appreciate so much the work that you've done, Jim. It's a pleasure to see you.
Yeah, same here, Ken. Thank you very much. Chamberlain was not known for his humor. Say that. I am not of Virginia's blood, she is of mine, he once said, and thought that was funny. He was one of his Reeves Sally. Yes, sir.
Thank you. How should I put this? How and when did you discover that Lawrence Chamberlain was a stutterer? Because I had not that I know everything, but I had never read that, especially when you read the written word as you so eloquently presented today, which in my opinion was the first time I've ever heard anyone go that direction, analyzing man's word and providing what you did so eloquently.
Thank you for saying that. I learned it from his memoir, which has only recently come to light. By recently, I mean within the last 12 years or so. This is going to be a lengthy answer to a short question, but all of his writing, almost everything, fell into the possession of his 2 children, Harold Willis Chamberlain and Grace Chamberlain Allen. Harold Willis died in the 20s. Grace Allen didn't die until 1937, at which point it went to 3 daughters. And honestly, they divided it up like you were dealing cards. They divided it up like that. And I don't know the story, but half of it went to one of the daughters, half of it went to the other, that memoir, right down the middle. So it started when I first found it at Bowdoin College on page 42. Boy, that'll keep you awake at night if you're a researcher. We subsequently found in private hands and it is now in the book at the Gettysburg Historical Society, the first part of it, and that's where I learned about it. Yes, sir.
I just wanted to know, what happened to the 3 men that refused to join the 20th Maine after Chamberlain talked to the other men from Maine? I was just curious.
They went to court martial.
I read about that. I was just wondering if that's...
I don't know after that what happened to them. I don't know. The answer is I don't know. That's a good question. I'm sorry, I don't have an answer. Thanks very much. Hey.
Hi. Just a quick, first of all, thank you for a lovely talk.
Well, thank you.
A lot of what you read from Chamberlain, some of the thoughts reminded me of Walt Whitman's writing.
Yes.
And Whitman talking often about the next generation and how we never really die because the next generation,
Right.
what are they going to think of us? So have you found connections that he read Whitman? I mean, most people did. Did he?
I can only make assumptions about it. There's no evidence of that other than they're quite alike in the way they look at that.
Well, and the other question I had in that regard, is that a common thing at that? I mean, after the Civil War, did people think about that perhaps more than we do today, about what the next generation is going to...
Yes, of course, it lent meaning to the sacrifice, to what they had all been through, and what was by the lights of most in the hands of Providence, and they had survived that. Just to quote the Duke of Wellington about the Battle of Waterloo, as it relates to this. He said of that battle, it was a day that needed a lot of saving, and it was a damn near thing. Well, I think that feeling caused them to want to tell their story of how close it was, how endangered we were as a country and as a people. And I think, well, Whitman certainly felt that, and Chamberlain sure did.
And not only to each other, but to the generations to come.
To the people who come, to us.
Right, to us. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. Oh, there you are. Hi.
I'm not so much asking a question as I just wanted to comment.
Okay.
I didn't know anything much about Chamberlain except what I saw in the movies, Gettysburg. Now, today, you brought that man alive for me in his spirituality, in his thoughts, in his thinking, in the way he felt himself as a man, and in his depth to what he felt was his fellow humanity. And for that, I thank you. I have been listening to speakers for the last 12 years, 8 here and some other places, and this is the best presentation I have ever heard. because you brought that man to life for me, and I thank you.
I'm trying not to cry. Thank you so much. He means a lot to me, of course. Yes, sir.
I just wondered if you could give us any further insights on what Chamberlain really think of Philip Sheridan's almost persecution of Gouverneur Cade Warren.
He thought Sheridan fired Warren and took the credit himself for the victory at Fire Forks. Chamberlain felt Warren won the battle, was fired at the end, so Sheridan could take the credit. And I'm researching and working on work on that very subject, on the Warren Court of Inquiry with all of its ramifications. That was essentially Chamberlain's view. By the way, I think that is published now, the findings of the Warren Court of Inquiry. And it's a wonderful study of a battle because everybody that was still alive in 1880 that commanded troops that day testified at that hearing, told what they did. And this isn't exactly on the subject you asked about, but let me give you an example of it, and because it does have to do with the verbatim English of these people. Gosh, now I can't remember who it was. He's on the stand. As they were kind of the Union was rolling up the Confederate line along the White Oak Road, he said, we retreated. It was General Couch. No, that's not Couch. Course, General Course. Confederate Brigade Commander. Right, it was Course. And asked Course, what happened then? He says, well, we retreated. He says, well, did you run? And of course said, well, I wouldn't call it running. And the lawyer, of course, says, well, okay, what would you call it? He says, I call it tall walking. That's the kind of verbatim English you get. It's just irreplaceable. Is that everybody?
All right, we have time for a short break. We will reconvene here at 3:30 for the Pickett's Charge panel.